Neil.
Well, good morning, Bill.
We're at FNC's Morning View. We hope all of you are having a fantastic morning. Today we have a guest host, Neil Olson, our General Counsel. Neil is going to be with us for the day. He may be here next week, we'll see. Bob Dorsey's out, and we're going to be talking about several things. The first thing we like to do is announce a new version of our ports. Specifically, we're going to be talking about a new version of AppraisalPort,
Which is great news, by the way.
Well, it is great news because it lots of functionality. It is, now we're going to talk a little about technical matters, of which I know about this much. It is browser independent. So if you have a current version of your browser, you want to talk about what a current version of the browser is? It's just a version that's supported by one of the major manufacturers, right? Currently.
Right.
We get lots of requests to support old browsers. That's a security issue.
Well, it's a security issue, and it's a problem because, you know, it actually hurts the user because it means they don't get to see or use as many things as if you use a newer, more modern browser.
So some of our banks request that we go back in their contract and support old browsers. We will no longer do that as a company because it presents a bigger security risk. But they're not patches. There are no security patches for those old browsers.
Absolutely.
And the manufacturer will not support that, nor will they warrant and rep they're going to support it.
Right.
And so it's a bigger security risk to go back and support those old browsers. So we'll support any current browser by the manufacturer.
Right. Right.
And so some of you are going to have to upgrade. I'm sorry. I'm just going to have to upgrade.
Hey, you know, I still have Windows 95.
I understand, but we don't support it anymore. Microsoft doesn't support it anymore.
Absolutely. No, you're absolutely right. You can't, when they stop supporting that browser, you're right. They don't put the patches in. You can't be sure that you closed all the doors on the old browser.
Some of our clients went apoplectic about this heartbleed bug.
Yep.
And if you had a browser that was not supported, I don't believe they provided a patch for that.
No.
And so it's a big deal.
Yeah.
So a new version of our ports, I'm told that it's going to launch on the 23rd of August. It's in beta now. You can hit it if you're a client. You can hit the new AppraisalPort and play with it, I believe. We've got some demo sites, test sites out there. It's going to launch on the 23rd of August. It'll be browser independent and it will support mobile, many things mobile, and we'll talk about that and some of our mobile solutions going forward. There's a roadmap for that. If you have some ideas that you would like to see supported for mobile and on the new AppraisalPort, please communicate that to your FNC account manager or account executive, and we'll funnel that through the appropriate product manager and make sure those features and functions come to fruition.
Yes.
Unless it's just some oddball, wild hair thing. All right. So having said all that, I'm going to use that to segue into today's central theme, which is third-party vendor management. And our ports have been managing appraisers, and now we're extending that to more inclusive third-party vendor management. You want to tell us about third-party vendor management?
Well, you know, there's always been a requirement if you're a regulated institution to manage your third parties. In fact, they're usually called service organizations or service and so on, and they've always been subject to regulation by the various agencies, the OCC, but now the defunct OTS and so on. But what we've seen is a
merged.
I'm sorry, they're merged. They're merged in as over time, but they've always been subject to regulation and so on, and because they're an extension of you as a regulated lender. What's happened is in October last year, the OCC issued this guidance on third-party relationships, an interesting term, that was much more, let's say, extensive, much more, I hate to say bureaucratic. Only a lawyer would have a favorite, you know, quotation, but I think this kind of gives you the tone of this. It says, a bank should conduct due diligence on all potential third parties before selecting and entering into a contract or relationship. Here's the key. A bank should not rely solely on experience or prior knowledge of the third party as a proxy for an objective, in-depth assessment. That means that even though you and I have worked together for 10 years successfully, you got to go back and do, you got to do it by the numbers.
Well, let's go back several years and let's talk about the regulatory mindset. And we're going to talk about after 9/11, and really before 9/11, there was a whole concept of know your customer.
Right.
And it really expanded after 9/11 on knowing your customer in the context of the Bank Secrecy Act and anti-money laundering. So you'll hear the acronym, for those of you that may not be in this area, BSA-AML.
Yes.
It's Bank Secrecy Act / anti-money laundering. And and the whole idea is you need to know what your customer is doing. And it's based on reporting, it's based on knowing that customer's activities. There's a general guideline about $10,000. And so it was designed initially to, unofficially, to protect against the laundering of drug money.
Right.
And then it was expanded to be against the laundering of money for terrorist organizations and things that were of illicit purposes.
Right.
All right, and to catch all of that. Well, this is an expansion of that concept of vendors. This is really know your vendor.
Yes, absolutely.
Right? It's all about knowing your vendor and who is your vendor. So I think they had some guidance out on knowing your vendor. This replaces that guidance, but I think this is the first many pieces to come out of the regulatory agencies on your vendor. I think they'll give more specific guidance in certain areas. So knowing your vendor really starts with a strategic plan. So what areas do you do? How do you do business? How do you make money? And a bank makes money two ways, interest income and non-interest income. And so what are the vendors that affect interest income and non-interest income? If you want a practical way to start, let's talk about a very practical way to start knowing your vendor. Go to accounts payable and get a list of every vendor you pay.
Right.
And then look at how much you pay them. That'll sort of divide the mission critical vendors from the non-mission critical vendors, right? I mean, let's just talk practical.
Sure.
That's not an absolute, but that'll give you a good starting point. Because my guess is the bank, you think the bank really knows who their vendors are today?
Not really. No, not really.
Comprehensively?
No.
This department knows, and that department knows.
They don't know who caters their lunches, and they don't know where they buy the pencils from for that branch. Absolutely.
And that's a great point. It says all.
Yeah.
It's not some.
Right.
It's all.
Right.
And so a good way to start is just to go through and find out who you're paying today.
Right.
You think they have contracts with everybody?
No.
Probably not. They probably issue purchase orders here and purchase orders there.
No.
They probably don't have contracts.
Right, and then somebody goes across the street and uses petty cash, and absolutely, the way it was done in the past. I think that's really what they're getting to is that. Well, you're really big vendors. Your check clearing contracts. The big data processing. That's one thing. But there's a whole panoply of people. In fact, the ones that on AppraisalPort, they're all vendors.
They're all vendors.
They're all vendors, and they're never any contracts. You might have a letter engagement, but it's always been extremely informal. Not unsuccessful, but very informal.
Informal, and to their credit, most financial institutions hire vendors on the basis of merit. Maybe not initially, but over time, they may not know the merits of an individual vendor. That's been part of the problem.
Right.
And so they have ranking systems and that sort of thing. We need to focus just for a moment on strategic sourcing. A lot of banks, to try to get their arms around this, have formed groups called strategic sourcing groups.
Right.
And so when you want to contract, you have to go through a strategic sourcing group so they can vet the vendor, they can standardize the contracting procedure, that sort of thing.
Right.
You want to comment any on that, or?
No, it's just that it means that it's kind of like I say, if you're only taking care of something, 10 things, you can do it on a spreadsheet. If you're doing with 100,000, you need a real process, and it requires strategic sourcing and others to have a real process to really do this and to keep track.
A lot of business units think strategic sourcing is just trying to get in their way,
right.
Slow down the process, impede them from
Right.
contracting who they want to contract with.
Right.
And in general, all the strategic sourcing group is trying to do is have a standard process,
Right.
promote independence and consistency, and hire the best value vendor for that job.
Right. Right.
Which is good. That's taking care of the bank's and shareholders' money.
Right.
And I think in general the guidance goes to that.
It absolutely does. But you can see there's that tension between the business units and the strategic sourcing people, because essentially when I have all this process, it will slow it down.
Process slows it down. It's just supposed to make you better.
Right.
And so, but slower in this case tends to be better because you've got things documented.
Right.
Well, Neil, we're out of time. I appreciate you sitting in today and doing a great job. Folks, we'll be back next week. This is F&C's Morning View. I'm Bill Rayburn, normally with Bob Dorsey, but today with Neil Olson. You all have a fantastic week. Goodbye.